in crowds to lay them down.
Shalom, shalom, la'am, Yahuah, ani shalomah, thura rabala shema. That is greetings, people of Yahuah. I'm shalomah. Thank you so very much for tuning in, for listening here. This is our fourth part of the series, an investigative series, another look at Paul, or Shaul. And if you're new here, have not caught the first three, I encourage you, please go back and do so, especially the first one, if not all the rest of them. The first one gives us a really good reason for even being at this point now where we're taking another look at Shaul. And y'all know I don't like to do long introductions, so we're going to hop right into it. Today, we're looking at Paul's apostleship calling and some very interesting findings here, I believe. So let's jump right to it. We're going to start off by defining the word apostle in our English language. But look at the word apostle. Look at Yhuh 13:16. And it says, let's look at this translation, TS 2009 first. 13:16, truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is an emissary, that's another word for apostle, greater than he who sent him. So let's look at this word here. And we're going to look at both Strong's and Thayer's, of course. Verily, verily, I say unto you, the servant is not greater than his master, neither he that is sent. This phrase, he that is sent, is one word in the Greek, and that's the word apostolos. And in the Strong's, it simply has it as a delegate, specifically an ambassador of the Basada, officially a commissioner of Mashiach, an apostle, messenger, he that is sent. And in Thayer's, basically the same thing, a delegate, messenger, one sent forth with orders. But look at this definition here. It says, in a broader sense, and we're going to look at this in detail, in a broader sense applied to other eminent Christian teachers. Right, we're going to look at that in detail. But this is what Paul is claiming that he is, right? He's claiming that he is an apostle, one that is sent. And he's basing that claim on this visionary experience that we looked at in our last study session. And I want to define a word that I did not do last time, but I want to look at Acts 26. And this is Paul rehearsing that visionary experience on the road to Damascus. And in verse number 19, he says, whereupon, O King Agrippa, I was not disobedient unto the heavenly vision. And look at this word vision real quick. This word vision, both in the Strong and Thayer, is basically the same thing, but it says the act of exhibiting oneself to a view. But it says this is in regards to what Paul saw, a sight, a vision, an appearance presented to one, whether asleep or awake. And in Strong's says visuality. But it says that is concretely an apparition, right? So Paul is basing his apostleship calling on this experience he had with an apparition. He said, this apparition sent me, so I am a sent one. That's what the word emissary or apostolos means in the Greek. Obviously, Mashiach would not have been speaking Greek. He'd have been speaking Aramaic, the lingua de franca of the day. So Salaya would have been what he probably used, right? But Paul says, I am a sent one. I'm a sent one. So let's go to Acts chapter number 1. And I know there are many of us out there who just say, just go to Acts 1, read the qualifications. They disqualify Paul. That's really the end of the story, should be. But the reason I'm going to Acts chapter 1 is because there's a very strong position, I believe it's a strong position, that states that Acts chapter 1, they're not qualifications for any person to be an apostle, but they're qualifications specifically to replace Yahudah or Judas as an apostle. And that is a strong position. And I'm going to show you why can be a strong position, I should say. And if you're not aware of it, then you can very well be shaken off of your position that Acts chapter number 1 is indeed or are indeed qualifications for an apostle. But look in verse 21. I know we know it, but I'm going to read it anyway. It says, it is therefore necessary that of the men who have been with us all the time that the Adon Yahushai went in and out among us, beginning from the immersion of Yhuh to the day that when he was taken up from us, that one of these should become a witness with us of his resurrection. So we say Shaul doesn't meet at least 2 or 3 of those qualifications, even if you want to give him that he saw the resurrected Yahusha, which we don't necessarily believe he did. Per the witness accounts that we have, it says he saw light, closed his eyes, heard a voice, opened his eyes, saw no one. Even though he says he saw the resurrected Yahusha, we can only couple those writings together to assume that the light that he saw is who he assumes is Yahusha, right? Even though his sighting of Yahusha is different than everybody else's sighting, he says, hey, this is who Yahusha is. He's a light. So moving on from that, even if you give him the resurrection, he doesn't meet the other two qualifications, so he cannot be an apostle. But there are those who view this as qualifications just for Judas's replacement, and I believe that is based off of presupposition. And you're going to hear me use that word probably throughout the entirety of the rest of this study session, because there's just so many presuppositions, and it's really based off of what I call a Pauline view of what an apostle is, right? And we're going to see what Paul's view is, but it's a Pauline view, and it's in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And notice here in verse number 5, he says, "In that he was seen by Kepha, then by the 12," right? The 12 what? The 12 apostles. "After that, he was seen by over 500 brothers at one time, of whom the greater part remain till now, but some have fallen asleep. After that, he was seen by Yaakov, then by all the emissaries." Well, what do you mean all the emissaries? You already said the 12. Are there more than 12 emissaries? Well, according to this Pauline view, there clearly are more than just 12. Well, how does Paul come up with the idea that there are more than 12 emissaries? Well, let's look at Luke. Let's look at Luke chapter. We're going to start in Luke chapter 9. And then we'll pull up Luke chapter 10 as well. But Luke chapter 9, verse 1. "And having called his 12 Talmudim, his taught ones, together, he gave them power and authority over all demons and to heal diseases. And he sent them to proclaim the reign of Elohim and to heal the sick. And he said to them, Take naught for your journey, neither staffs, nor bag, nor bread, nor silver, and neither have two undergarments. In whatever house you enter, stay there, and go out from there," and so on and so on, and goes, right? So he sends out his 12. He gives them authority and power. Go proclaim the good news. But then look in Luke chapter number 10, verse 1. "And after this, the Adon appointed 70 others and sent them 2 by 2 ahead of him into every city and where he himself was about to go. Then he said to them," actually, let's go down to verse number 4, because you're going to hear the similarities. "Do not take a purse, nor a bag, nor sandals, and greet no one along the way. And whatever house you enter, first say, Peace to this house,' and so on and so forth it goes." So you can see the similarities. He sent out his 12, and he gave them power and authority and all these things and gave them instructions. Then he sent out 70 others. And so this is where I believe Paul's view of, hey, there must be more emissaries or more sent ones than just the 12. And you can clearly see that. And that's why I'm saying, hey, Acts chapter number 1, they have a strong argument. Those who believe that have a strong argument that it could be replacement just for Judas, because there are apparently unto them more than just 12 emissaries. But let's go to Luke chapter number 6. And I'm going to show you why Acts 1 is indeed, or are indeed the qualifications to be an apostle, and how the term that was used is not to be understood in a broad sense, but more in a specific sense. Look at Luke chapter 6, and let's look at verse 12. "And in those days it came to be that he went out to the mountain to pray, and was spending the night in prayer to Yahuah. And when it became day, he called near his taught ones, his Talmudim, and chose from them 12, whom he also named emissaries," apostles, sent ones, right? So after spending a night in prayer, praying to his father, very obviously his father gave him some instructions, go pick some men. So he brought these men to him, and those 12 men he called emissaries, right? Let's go to Mark chapter number 3. This is a parallel passage to Luke. And in Mark chapter number 3, and let's read this. And I'm going to pull them up side by side, or one on top of another, so you can see that they're parallel passages one to another. So Mark chapter 3, verse 13. And it reads, "And he went up on the mountain." Obviously, we just read that he went up on the mountain to pray. We saw that. And then after praying, he says, "And called to him whom he wanted, and they came to him." And notice, this is a key passage here. "And he appointed 12 to be with him, and to be sent out to proclaim." And then he gives, all these things that he's sending them out with, and then he names them. And the reason there's a parallel passage is because the same thing happens. He goes into the mountain in Luke chapter 6, he calls the 12, and then he names them. So these are parallel passages. But what I want you to see is in Mark chapter 3, verse 14, he says, "And he appointed 12 The word appointed, sometimes we say ordained in other translations. He appointed them to be with him. With him. The same 12 that he appointed to be with him are the ones that he also named sent ones or emissaries. This is the very first qualification when it comes to being an apostle, is that you had to be appointed to be with him. As you read the rest of the scriptures, you won't ever find Yahusha calling any of the other people that he sent out emissaries. He only called these 12 emissaries, apostles, or sent ones. What he did was he took a general term. Remember, he doesn't speak Greek. He speaks in Aramaic, right? Salaya is the term, or Salaya will be the term in Aramaic. But what he does is he takes this term sent ones and he basically makes it a title and just not a broader definition of the word. Whereas you recall Paul is from Tarsus, from Turkey, a Roman citizen. Without doubt, Paul, he's been Hellenized, is basically what the point I'm trying to make. He's been Hellenized. To some degree, we believe that. And there's plenty of evidence of that. You can read his writings, his knowledge of Greek literature, etc. He's viewing this through a Greek lens, through a Hellenized lens. He's taking this term and just generalizing it, right? But what Yahusha does is he makes it specific to just those 12. And the very first qualification is that you had to be with him. Why was that important? Remember, this is after spending time and pray with the Father. This is the Father's instructions to Yahusha. Take these men and take them with you. They were with him in the boat when it was rocking and the sea was going crazy. And he was walking on the water and he hopped in the boat and said, "Peace, be still." They were with him when that happened. And only they saw that. They were with him at the Mount of Transfiguration when the clouds came and they heard a voice saying, "This is my beloved, hear ye him." And when the clouds dispersed, they only saw Yahusha. They were with him and only they were with him. They were with him in the tent when everybody was laughing and mocking and scorning. And he tossed them out and he took a couple of them who were in his inner circle and he said, "You come in here with me." And he healed the little girl. They were with him and they were the only ones with him when that happened. They were with him when they saw the 5 loaves and 2 fishes turn into feeding 5,000 people. They were with him when 12 baskets were taken back. They were with him when he went from city to city, in and out. They were with him in the mountain when he expounded to them the parable so that they would have a greater understanding than anybody else would when it comes to the kingdom of Elohim. They were with him. They had exclusive access to Yahusha HaMashiach that nobody else had, so they could see how he lived. They could see, learn what he talked about in greater detail than anybody. They can see how he interacted with the Pharisees. They had exclusive access that nobody else had. That's important. Why? Because one day they will be called on to give up their lives for what they had witnessed. Not just what they had heard by a third party, but what they had witnessed. And on those witness stands and on those polls, they will be able to say, "I saw with my eyes this man healed a girl and she raised it from, I saw with my eyes." The Most High knows that there are things that human beings, when we see them and when we hear them, you can't shake us from them. And he needed some men that would be unshakable on their belief because they were going to have to die for those things that they were witnessing. And so the very first qualification is that you had to be appointed to be with him, because those 12 were going to be the foundations of what he was bringing to the earth. As Revelation shows us, there are 12 foundations, right, in the New Jerusalem. And so they were called to be with him. It says, matter of fact, they were appointed. That word appointed, we often say in our English language, they were ordained. So when we get back to Acts chapter number 1, what do you think Peter is getting these qualifications from? Let's go back to Acts chapter number 1, verse 21. And notice, remember, Yahusha, he goes into the mountain to pray. Praise to the Father. Look at Acts 1. Look at this in verse 14. And all these were continuing with one mind in prayer and supplication with the women and Miriam, the mother of Yahusha, and with all his brothers. And in those days, Kepha standing up in the midst of them of the Talmudim, right? So after spending time in prayer, Kepha stands up in the midst of them. And this is where he starts saying, "Hey, we got to get a replacement apostle." And then he lays out the qualifications. The very first qualification, he says in verse 21, "It is therefore necessary that of the men who have been with us." You see, Kepha doesn't make up these qualifications on his own. He's following the one who set out those qualifications. You had to be with him. Peter says, you have to be with us. Shaul does not meet the very first qualification laid out not by Kepha, but laid out by Yahusha. Yahusha's words are important. That's why we must always go back to the Father's words. That's why we must go back to Yahusha's words first before we go to anybody else's words. Yahusha said, my words are not my own. They're my Father. My teachings are not my own. They are my Father. Yahusha lays out the very first qualification to being an emissary, and is that you had to be appointed to be with him. Shaul does not meet that qualification. What Shaul does is he makes a distinction between sent ones and sent ones, or apostles and apostles. He says 12 apostles, other apostles. But what Yahusha does, he makes a distinction between taught ones and sent ones. These are my taught ones, but these 12 taught ones have graduated, and they're going to be with me everywhere I go, and they're going to be titled sent ones, right? That's the difference between the view that Yahusha had and the view that Shaul had, right? So I think you get my point here. But what I want to look at further now is look at Luke chapter 8, verse 1. Excuse me for flipping back and forth real quick. But look at Luke chapter 8, verse 1. I'm just going to hound this point a little bit more, and then I'll be done here. But Luke chapter 8, verse 1. And it came to be afterward that he went through every city, through every city and village, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the reign of Elohim, and the 12 were with him. With him, you see? So I'm just stressing the point that was the very first qualification to be an apostle, was that you had to be with him. And that's why Peter lays out that same qualification. You had to be with us, right? So let's move on from that and look at Romans chapter 11, verse 13. Because what we're going to find out here is what Paul does is he claims that he's an apostle, right? But not just really an apostle. He's really the apostle to the Gentiles, right? Some translations have it this way. It says, Romans chapter 11, verse 13. For I speak to you Gentiles, insomuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles. I magnify my office. Now, there are others that have it says I'm an apostle, but you're going to find out throughout Paul's writings that he indeed believed that he was the apostle, the designated apostle to the Gentiles. And what he does is he sets himself up as an authority. Now, I'm not going to jump too far ahead, but he sets himself up as an authority, and he really compares himself and puts himself on the same status as the 12, as we're going to find out later in other study sessions, y'all willing. But he says, I'm the apostle to the Gentiles. So the question I'm posing here is, did we really need one designated man to be the apostle, the delegate to the Gentiles? Well, we have in Matthew chapter 15, I'm not going to read all these, but Matthew 15, 21 through 28, Mark 5, 1 through 20, Yhuh 12. Look at Yhuh 12, 20 through 21. I'll look at that one. Yhuh 12, 20 through 21. And it says, and there were certain Greeks among those coming up to worship at the festival. Certain Greeks. Not Yasharal, Greeks. That means they're other nations. That means they're Gentiles. These men came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida of Galilee, and were asking him, saying, Master, we wish to see Yahusha. So here are some Greeks. And if you read the rest of that account there, you find out that he gives them, the good news, and part of the good news. And all the other passages I mentioned before, the good news was first preached to the Gentiles by Yahusha himself. Even though he was sent to the lost sheep of Yasharal, we know there are instances where he gave the good news to the Gentiles. And then after that, in Yahusha chapter 28, verse 19, notice who he tells. This is pre-Paul. Therefore, go and make taught ones, disciples, taught ones, Talmudim of all the nations, immersing them in the name, right? All the nations. That means ethnos, every people group. Luke chapter 24, verse 47. I'm just hitting you with scripts. That's all. Luke 24 through 47. 24, 47. And that repentance and forgiveness of sin should be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. Okay. And you are witnesses of these matters, right? So you said you begin at Jerusalem, but you don't stay at Jerusalem. Let me tell you where else you got to go. In Acts chapter 1, verse 8, he says this. But you shall receive power when the Ruach, or the set-apart spirit, Ruach HaKodesh, has come upon you, and you shall be my witnesses. Got to start in Jerusalem, and in all Yehudah, and Shemarom, and to the end of the earth, right? What is the end of the earth? What does the end of the earth include? Well, they include Gentiles. Yeah, there's some of our folks that have been scattered, but Gentiles as well. And matter of fact, look in Acts chapter number 8. Look at verse number 26. But a messenger of Yahuah spoke to Philip, saying, Arise and go toward the south along the way which goes down from Jerusalem to Azaz, or Gaza as we know it today. That is not part of Jerusalem. That is Gentiles. That was part of it. He says that is a desert. And he arose and went and saw a man of Cush. That is not Yasharal. That is Gentile, a eunuch of great authority under, that's Candace, the sovereigness of the Cushites, Gentile nations. So he gives the good news to a man of Cush. And we know that man of Cush goes back to his city as history tells us. Go back to his land as history tells us. Look at chapter 8, verse 40. Philip, however, was found at Ashdod, another Gentile city, and passing through, he brought the good news in all the cities until he came to Caesarea. I forgot to mention when Yahusha healed that demoniac man, he said he went back to his city and his town, which was a Gentile town as well. So the good news is already being preached to Gentiles, often, apparently. So the question is, did we need one designated guy to go preach the good news when it's already been preached to the Gentiles up to this point? Apparently we did not, right? What is interestingly enough, matter of fact, let me slow down and go back to Acts chapter 11. And in Acts chapter 11, verse number 18, Kepha reported how he was used to give the good news to the nations. Now we know the story. This is about the dream he had about with Cornelius. But it says, and having heard this in verse number 18, they were silent and praised Elohim, saying, then Elohim has indeed also given to the nations repentance to life, the Gentiles, that's the nations. So the good news was being preached to the Gentiles before Paul ever hit the scene, right? And what you're going to find out in every instance where apostles is mentioned outside of the 12, it's always in association with someone that Paul, had to deal with. Sylvanus, Barnabas, all those or in Paul's writings, and he identifies in the apostles. The apostles never identified anybody else as an apostle. Yahusha never identified anybody else as an apostle. It was only the 12 that have ever been identified as apostles. And after they die, and after the first century, you still don't find anybody else identifying themselves in any writings as apostle. That whole idea of apostles outside of the 12, that kind of dies off when Paul dies, and it kind of resurges back in like the early 1900s or something like that, if my history is correct. Basically, the point being made, I think, is clear. Apostles were just the 12. You had to be appointed to be with him. There were only 12, or maybe a little bit more, because you got the replacement that fit that description. Paul did not fit that characteristic. He did not fit that qualification. Therefore, he shouldn't have taken on the title as an apostle. It's just that simple. We're going to stop there for now, because we're going to get into Paul's good news message. And man, that one's going to hit heavy. So if you have, gained any insight, learn anything, please share this, like this with others, and come back, subscribe if you haven't done so already. And we're going to get even deeper into Paul's teachings and compare them to what Yahusha taught, and look at Paul's, what he calls my gospel is what he says it is. So until next time, learn the word, live the word, and share the word. Shalom.
I am chasing Christ.